beaucoup, merci Annelise, merci à Incal pour m'inviter. Je vais parler en anglais, je suis désolée, mais mon français pas tellement là. Alors, so yes, I am an archaeologist primarily. I teach art history, and increasingly I'm working with museums. So I have been trying to develop ways to bring these different areas of interest together and to find opportunities for my students. So I know many of you are students in archaeology and art history, correct? So you will have opportunities in culture for jobs, of course, as well as in archaeology itself. So I thought I could share my research and how I'm applying sort of my background in archaeology and art history specifically to museums. And maybe this is something that you will be able to work with as well. So in the United States, typically one chooses to go into the academic side or the museum side. And there's very little crossover. So once you choose, you typically stay there. And that's not always the case, but it's often the case. And that can create a sort of division between the two worlds. So there's a museum perspective, and there's an academic perspective. So our project has been trying to get past that division and kind of bring those two areas together. Training on both sides of that, museums and academic, is specialized. And that's one of the challenges, is if you are on the academic side, you may not have the specialized training in museums and vice versa. But that's not an obstacle that can't be overcome. There's a lot of room for the academic researcher to bring her work to the public by collaborating with museums. There is arguably an ethical imperative to do so. As archaeologists, we have to be good stewards of the past that we uncover, and making that past accessible to the public is one way to achieve that goal. Often our work ends up in journals or in dense archaeological reports that very rarely reach the public eye. If we're only writing for each other, what's the point of our work? The notion of the museum, the mission of the museum, at its most basic level, is to connect the public to human stories through objects. We can partner with museums and contribute to those stories. So today I want to talk about object biography as a way to connect our work to museum objects and to connect our work and our stories about the past to the public. Object biography as an approach has had a moment in recent years. As Annelise mentioned, we met in a session dedicated to object biography, and that represents a sort of new energy in this area. But I want to sort of walk you through very briefly what I see as the theoretical movement towards object biography in archaeology. Scholars' interest in object biography is part of a larger intellectual trend. In archaeology, we can see its beginnings in the post-processual approaches of the 80s and 90s that emphasized agency over process. Moving from big systems to individuals as agents was like a powerful zoom lens, allowing us to understand change in society as coming from the people in those societies making choices that were not simply adaptive or based on economic optimization, but could be based in a variety of complex beliefs and values. Oops, sorry, I didn't realize that wasn't there. Okay. At the same time, disciplines such as art history and anthropology were developing an interest in material culture studies. As an archaeologist, I thought, of course, material culture. Archaeologists have always been interested in material culture, obviously, but these material culture studies and materiality, as we call it now in archaeology, asks us to think about objects as agents themselves, rather than looking at material culture for how it reflects past individuals and their agency or those processes. Materiality studies look at material culture as actively shaping the past by acting on individuals and affecting the choices that they made. So objects as agents. Object biography coalesced as an area of study in 1999, as an area of study in archaeology, I should say, in 1999, when the World Archaeology volume, The Cultural Biography of Objects, was published. The notion, however, can be traced back to sociology and anthropology, most notably Kopytov's 1986 paper, which encouraged us to think about objects as not having a singular frozen moment or significance, but as things that changed hands and acquired or lost value, were discarded and found again. Various museums are adopting this approach. The Pitt Rivers Museum at Oxford is one, and on their website, they talk about object biography as an idea that goes back to the 19th century, so they trace it back even further than Kopytov. So the two methodological approaches, materiality and object biography, inform each other because object biography asks us to consider not only the life of the object, but how it interacted with and continues to interact with people. Ian Hodder, more recently, has described this interaction as entanglement, which is a nice way of referring to the fact that the agency goes in both directions. Museums are a natural venue in which to interpret, develop, and share object biographies. The museum, as a site for telling stories, opens up multiple pathways through which the object biography can be communicated, through displays, object labels, websites, audio guides, lectures, publications, etc. The many intersections among biography and museums have been explored in recent literature, such as these, yet there has been little focus in these studies on collections of antiquities. Ancient objects have complex ancient lives, but they also have rich and sometimes problematic modern afterlives. The stories of their human entanglements, both in antiquity and in more recent times, from the ground to the museum case, are dynamic, multifaceted biographies that can take a visitor far beyond the static and limited facts of a standard museum label. While museums tend to focus on a single moment of meaning from an object's past, telling us perhaps that an object is an Attic amphora, museum visitors may be equally as interested in where the piece was found, how it got into a tomb in Italy in the first place, how it came to be displayed in a museum in their city. Instead of keeping this information in object files away from the visitor's view, object biography encourages museums to tell a fuller story of an object and to engage the visitor with that story. In so doing, object biography can provide a solution to the problem some museums face of how to address unprovenienced works of art. Many museums acquired, at various moments in their history, objects which originated on the art market and lack an archaeological find spot. Transparency in such matters is of increasing importance from an ethical perspective. Yet worries linger that admission of past collecting practices will taint the reputation of founders, donors, curators, or the institution itself. A robust object biography, presenting the full story of an object as far as it's known and highlighting the missing information, such as archaeological provenience, can provide an honest account of the object while also engaging museum visitors. One value of object biography as a heuristic concept is that it allows multiple points of entry into object research. There are many moments in the life of an object, and those require different types of research to understand. As academic researchers, we can contribute to an object biography through research in areas such as archaeological provenience, object provenance, and we use these terms differently in English, which is why I've glossed them here to distinguish between the two, provenience and provenance. Stylistic analysis, epigraphy, and technological study. These are all specialized areas of study and take time and expertise to carry out. Such work provides often needed support to museums whose small curatorial staff may not have time to thoroughly research every object. Object biography allows the investigation of the early contexts of a work, but also encourages the study of its recent history, how we in modern times have created our own relationships to the piece. The objects exist in our time, and they can really only be viewed through the lens of a modern interpretation. By allowing the modern life of an artifact to be part of its story, along with its ancient life, deposition, and recovery, we can help mitigate the dissociative nature of its museum display. Such an approach also foregrounds the question of the object's acquisition, which was in many cases by means of the art market, and before that, the looting of an archaeological site. The destruction wrought to cultural heritage by looting obliges scholars to make the provenance of an object, its modern ownership history, a transparent part of its story. So my example then. For the past several years, I've been part of a collaborative project in Houston, which brought together a group of scholars and students to work with curators, conservators, and the registrar of the Menil collection in Houston, a small art museum with a diverse collection, including surrealism, contemporary art, the arts of Africa and Oceania, and the arts of the ancient Mediterranean. I worked with my colleague, John Hopkins, then a professor at Rice University in Houston, and Paul Davis, the curator of collections at the Menil, to develop ways to bring more research attention to the ancient Mediterranean collection, which had been understudied for years. One outcome of that project is a volume of object biographies produced by scholars who took part in the project. That book, which will be published next year, includes chapters dedicated to several works in the collection, as well as perspectives on this type of research from other institutions. The volume will be an important contribution to the Menil's collection of ancient Mediterranean art, because the museum adheres to a strict aesthetic around their displays, which keeps label information to a bare minimum. So the visitor, until now, has been provided with very little context about the objects. So the book is a way for the museum to maintain the minimal labeling practice while also providing more object information. The chapters in the book approach object biography in varying ways, since each object has different information available. For example, in some cases, ancient provenience could be determined. In others, provenience was so questionable that the possibility the work is a forgery was left open. For some objects, the modern biography is richer than the ancient one. In all chapters, we maintained the ethical standards of our academic organizations by being transparent about the way the works were acquired and the information that was lost as a result of pieces being looted and sold on the market. So as an example, I want to share with you the work that I did on a statue from Mesopotamia. I'll begin by introducing the object, and then I'll share the biography that I developed for it. Among the earliest examples of the human form in the Manil collection is a piece titled Votive Figure. The intense and thoughtful gaze, gentle smile, and earnestly clasped hands have made it one of the most iconic and appealing objects in the collection. We do not know its archaeological provenience, and therefore can say little about the precise context in which it was first meaningful. While its simple presence in the galleries can facilitate the type of personal encounter so central to the Manil Collections project, that moment of encounter today conceals a richer and more complex history, which we are intellectually and ethically obliged to investigate. The votive figure is a Sumerian sculpture of a man. It's made of alabaster, stands 30.5 centimeters high, and is dated to the early Dynastic period in Mesopotamia. The figure stands on a shallow base. His hands are clasped at chest height. His torso is bare, with nipples inlaid in lapis lazuli. He wears a textured skirt, often referred to by the Greek word konakes. Particular to the art of this time period, the garment is tufted and made of sheepskin. It's usually worn by men, but sometimes by women, and evidently at different levels in society in a variety of contexts, as shown by its depiction in other early dynastic imagery. These skirts often feature a tail-like tassel at the back, which is sometimes actually identified as the tail of the animal. It's typically on the left side. On this example, the tassel is just off center on the right side. The tufted knee-length skirt is notable for the detail and high relief of its fleecy texture. The head is bald and beardless. The sensitively modeled face has a prominent, realistically rendered nose. A slight smile at the mouth draws the lips back and adds fullness to the cheeks. Inlaid materials accentuate large eyes and a prominent brow. The ears are carefully shaped. The shoulders and elbows form strong angles, counterbalancing the conical shape of the skirt. The heavy straight legs and large feet were evidently not structurally sound enough to support the piece, and a metal pin was inserted to support it. An analysis of that metal suggests that it is most likely ancient, but we don't know when it was inserted. The feet are parallel on the base. The back of the figure, as you can see, bears an inscription in Sumerian cuneiform, most recently translated as Eonatum, Viceroy of Lagash, son of Akragal. Sculpture such as this became common in Mesopotamia in the 3rd millennium BC. There are about 550 similar examples. They were placed as votive objects in temples to represent and even to act as watchful devotees to the gods. Most of the figures do not carry inscriptions. When they do, they bear the name of a ruler. The 3rd millennium BC in southern Mesopotamia, called the early dynastic period because it features the earliest records of dynastic kingship in the region, was marked by shifts in power and the gradual rise of what has been called a more charismatic form of kingship. In that context, inscribed royal statuary became gradually more common. The inscriptions provide a partial record of dynastic history in the 3rd millennium, and so they become an important part of the construction, the reconstruction of that history. When the archaeological context is known, statues such as these come exclusively from temple contexts. Scholars often compare them to a votive candle in a church today. They would serve as offerings to the god, but also as a physical manifestation of the devotion and prayer of an individual. More than just symbols of worship, the works embodied the devotee and acted on his or her behalf. There are texts that describe rituals to instill life and breath into a statue, providing some evidence of that belief in embodiment. So at this point, my observations about the work are based on rather standard art historical analysis, as well as what is generally known archaeologically about similar work. Now I will try to turn those details into a more biographical approach, in which what we know, but also what we don't know, becomes more evident. The story of any object is a nuanced one. Objects change hands. Their functions and meanings shift with each human interaction. They acquire new meanings through associations with people, places, and events. They can be reused, repurposed, discarded. When they are unearthed, they're subject to the interpretation of archaeologists and art historians. In a modern museum, ancient objects are transformed. In this case, a religious votive object becomes art. Encased, labeled, and lit, on display in the museum gallery, these works might enlighten, inspire, or even confuse the museum visitor. All of these moments in the life of the object constitute its biography. At the very beginning of the biography of this piece, it was made by a person in a place for a purpose. It's very challenging to recreate that moment without the archaeological context. Stylistic comparisons to other works provide the best clue for its place and time of origin. These comparisons pose a challenge, owing to the possible reuse and modification of the statue during Sumerian times. So, in an earlier attempt to use style to place and date this figure, Pierre Amier noted that certain features, such as the freestanding legs, are characteristic of examples from the beginning of the early dynastic period, such as the hoard I showed you a moment ago from Tel Asmar, as it's being unearthed, and here on display. Conversely, Amier found that the elaborately tufted skirt of the Menil figure was typical of examples associated with later phases of the early dynastic. Amier also grappled with the inscription. The inscription names the king that I mentioned, Eannatum. Eannatum is well known. He is also on the famous Stela of the Vultures that is in the Musée du Louvre. And so he's dated to the later part of the early dynastic period. So Amier managed these different clues by suggesting that King Eannatum reused an earlier statue and had his name inscribed on it. The stylistic idiosyncrasies noted by Amier are only a small part of the puzzle, in fact. The Tel Asmar hoard This group of statues found cached in the square temple of Abu at Tel Asmar is one of the earliest groups of early dynastic statuary based on stratigraphy. And I think it's important to always be clear about whether we are dating something based on style or based on stratigraphy. Several of the works from Tel Asmar, like this largest one here, feature these freestanding legs, which is one of the points of similarity that Amier had noted between the Tel Asmar figure and the Menil figure. They often have very lifelike details added, like carved toenails. And there's other features of the work that are similar, such as the very sharp angles in the arms, the delicate forearms, and the arrangement of the clasped hands. However, some of the Asmar pieces are holding vessels, whereas the Menil's figure are clasped, but it's not holding a vessel. So there are differences in details such as that. There's also differences, as you can see, in the skirt. The skirts on the Asmar statues are long. The texture is typically limited to the fringe at the bottom of the skirt, which is clearly different than what we see on the Menil example. The proportions of the Asmar works are different as well. The Menil piece has a stockier body and a larger head. The larger head of the votive figure draws attention to the naturalistic style of the carving. The figure shown here on the right from the Asmar group has large eyes, which are similar, and notably large pupils, but he lacks the careful modeling of the nose, the mouth, the cheeks. The Menil figure's hands are also held away from the body, and it's hard to see this in the photo, but on the right, the hands are attached, and on the Menil piece, they're separated by about 1 centimeter. And that's a very fragile arrangement, and it's surprising to find that level of workmanship. So identifying certain features as similar or dissimilar in this way is a standard part of this kind of stylistic comparison. But what I would say we need to avoid is immediately identifying features from this example, which is archaeologically early, and then saying those stylistic features are also archaeologically early. So that was kind of the pattern that Amier and others were following, to say that a simple skirt and a more schematic face is early, and a more realistic carving of the face and a more elaborate skirt is late. But when we look at other examples, it becomes very muddy. So to show you what I mean, I'm adding a third example here from the site of Kafaja. The Nintu temple, or small shrine, at the site of Kafaja has levels that date from the early dynastic I, that is the beginning, to the very late early dynastic period. The stratigraphic sequence is challenging, but the sculptures also present stylistic complexity. So there are sculpture from later archaeological phases that show stylistic features one would expect from earlier phases, and vice versa. So for example, this piece from level 6, which is the early dynastic, bears certain similarities to the Menil example. Unlike the abstract works that were thought to be more typical of the earlier period, you can see it has a more rounded head, a more expressive face, it has the textured skirt. And two scholars who have worked on the dating of these pieces noted that that fully tufted skirt on male figures is very rare until the very end of the early dynastic period. So it doesn't fit here archaeologically. It's too early, according to that schema. Other works that are contemporary to this one from Kafaja are much more sort of flat and schematic looking, less fully carved. So the site, with its stylistic and stratigraphic complexities, reminds us that there are going to be local and regional variations, that pieces may have a very long life in a temple before they're discarded, and works may also be reused and repurposed and even recarved. Another site with comparative work is Mari in Syria. Caches of sculpture found in the excavation of temples at Mari on the Euphrates River date to the early dynastic 3B, so the very end of the early dynastic. Several of these have freestanding legs, like the Manil votive figure. The figures from Mari, however, typically have the left foot forward of the right, while the Manil work has both feet side by side. The hands, you may note here, are held away from the body, so that's a similarity there. Not quite as delicate, but held away from the body. Here are some more figures from Mari, so you can get a better sense of the diversity. This group of statues from Mari bear other similarities to the Manil piece, as well as some further differences. The proportions and the expressively carved faces are similar to the votive figure. Some have the nipples carved to allow inlay, as seen in the inlaid lapis lazuli nipples of the votive figure. Some of the tufted skirts are elaborately textured in high relief, though they tend to be longer and fall below the knees. A support behind the left leg of, in fact, behind this one, and there is a support, give these pieces that extra stability that the Manil figure evidently lacked. So, in summary, looking at these stylistic comparisons, there are characteristics of the Manil piece that link it to works from the early dynastic 1, 3A, 3B periods from various sites, from different moments in the early dynastic period. So style alone cannot be used to determine a clear date or a place for the creation of the votive figure. The strongest similarities I find are to works from Mari, but the differences are notable as well. So without a known provenience and without a clear stylistic comparison, a significant part of the early life of the statue has to remain uncertain. At that moment of sort of using the stylistic analysis, I think it's really important to point out that the lack of archaeological provenience still poses a problem. And I think one thing that can happen often in a museum display is to gloss over that and use the stylistic comparison to establish a date or a place as though it is known, when in fact it's not based on provenience. The purpose of the statue in the past is easier to reconstruct, again using similar provenienced works as evidence. What's known of this temple statuary would suggest that a person dedicated the statue as a gift to the god. Some early dynastic statuary has a royal name inscribed on it, as I mentioned, but most of the corpus is uninscribed and was evidently dedicated by common people, to what extent we can understand that, both men and women. So there are details about those people that we'll never know. We don't know their occupation, we don't know their social class, but we can say that making an offering such as one of these statues would entail a notable expense. The stone used in most cases was a locally available form of gypsum, but there are additional materials added, including shell, lapis lazuli, ivory, metal, and wood. These are substantial in size, so they must have been high-status items. These may have been the most significant and probably the only artistic commission in the donor's life. So while the statue served as this material extension of the donor's devotion to the gods, it was subject to new material encounters in the temple. Once it was dedicated, Jean Evans argues, a statue would begin a new phase of its life, separated from the person whom it originally represented. And in this new role, it could receive offerings from other donors. It could be moved around within a temple. It could be physically altered. Repairs might be made using materials such as dowels and bitumen. A new statue could be assembled from parts of multiple originals. A statue such as the Manil piece presumably could have had a long life within the temple and represented the petitions and appeals of various individuals before the god or gods. The metal rod that was inserted to help stabilize the statue suggests repair and perhaps a long lifespan. A recent analysis of the work found that there were also repairs to the wrists and forearms at some point in the past. We don't know if that was in antiquity or in modern times. Recarving of the figure, which could explain some of the stylistic anomalies, has not been attested through analysis. The inscription raises a further question regarding reuse. So King Eannatum of Lagash was a king later in the early dynastic period. And as I mentioned, Pierre Amier had suggested that the inscription was his later addition to an earlier statue. In that scenario, Eannatum would have taken a piece formerly associated with at least one other person and made it speak for him through the addition of the inscription. I'll return to that possibility as well as its problems in a moment. But continuing in the ancient life of the piece, at some point, a statue reached the end of its usefulness in the temple. An object dedicated to, and therefore belonging to, a god could not be removed from the temple. Sometimes works were deposited as hoards, buried or even built into the architecture of the temple. Unlike a number of broken statues found at Tel Asmar and Kafaja, the Manil statue is in very good condition. Its head is attached to the body, the nose and the right ear are fully intact. The delicate hands are present, if once broken. So these factors would suggest that it was deliberately and carefully cached, rather than accidentally lost or deposited in a destruction event. Okay, moving to the modern phase of its life, between the ancient and modern chapters, the votive statue spent some time in the ground. Ancient buildings in Mesopotamia, and you all as archaeologists will know this, made of mud brick, were periodically leveled and rebuilt. Deposition of alluvial and wind-blown soil further buries artifacts. Over time, that process can leave objects deep below the modern ground surface. Beginning in the 18th and especially the 19th century, Europeans with an interest in archaeology and biblical history began to investigate early sites in the region. By the early 20th century, archaeologists were employing better methodologies and recording practices, resulting in an ever clearer understanding of ancient societies. The art historian and archaeologist Henri Frankfurt, whose early 20th century excavations in Iraq revealed hoards of temple statuary similar to this, discussed these works for the first time in aesthetic terms that established their place in the narrative of art history. The recognition of artifacts as objets d'art makes them desirable to collectors. The new attention to past sites and the fetishization of artifacts as art incentivize looters who recognize the growing market for Mesopotamian antiquities. Looting is always a risk, both to sites under study and those not yet excavated. Most archaeological sites face some level of looting at some point, and I'm sure you've come across this. I think every site I've worked at has been looted at some point to some extent. Conflicts and times of economic hardship bring greater threats to archaeological sites as there's more opportunity and incentive for looting and destruction. We don't know the circumstances under which the Menil statue was recovered from the ground in modern times, so that's another missing chapter in its life. It was acquired by Dominique de Menil in 1983 from a dealer in Europe. The work was evidently unknown in 1981. In her comprehensive study of Near Eastern statuary from that year, Agnès Spiket does not mention the piece, and moreover, notes that there were no statues in the round of Eonatum yet known, raising the possibility that the statue had not yet been unearthed as of that date. We can only speculate as to Dominique de Menil's interest in acquiring the piece, as she herself noted in the foreword to the catalog published at the opening of the collection in 1987. That's the year that her personal collection was made public in the museum. She said, "Complex sets of circumstances brought these treasures into the family. A chance encounter, a visit to an artist or dealer, a glance at an auction catalog. Such a chance encounter was evidently what brought her together with this statue. According to one account, the Votive Statue caught de Menil's attention while she was negotiating a separate transaction with a dealer. The human figure is a theme of her collection, and I've shown you pictures of her with two other works of the human form, and it's a theme that repeats throughout the collection. So for that reason, the devout intensity of this figure may have appealed to her. The de Menil's interest in the sacred quality of art has been well documented. In the catalog text, written in 1987, Dominique de Menil mentioned the figure's large inlaid eyes that give it a mysterious gaze and suggests that the piece represents a search for spirituality. The high quality of the carving and the royal inscription may have given the statue particular appeal to de Menil. The royal inscription on the work makes the votive figure unusual. Most of the statuary is uninscribed. The men, the women, and the children whose images were placed in temples were, as I said, for the most part what we might consider a common person. Their names were not known. The Menil piece, however, bears the name of a king. The stela of the vultures, on which Eonatum's name is best known from, was excavated in the 1880s and is in the Musée du Louvre. The stela illustrates a battle, and it includes a long inscription relating the conflict between Eonatum's home city, Lagash, and the neighboring city of Umma. The names and deeds of Eonatum are therefore relatively well known and have been for over a century. Compared to the rest of 3rd millennium BC history, which is fairly murky. So inscribed on the back of this votive figure, his name, genealogy, and city name elevate the Menil statue to a special status among the corpus of early dynastic sculpture. No longer anonymous, no longer representing a common person, it's the only image in the round of a well-known early dynastic king. However, according to scholars, Marchesi and Marchetti, who have worked on this period, particularly on the epigraphy, the inscription on the Menil piece is probably a modern addition. Various incongruities in the inscription's form, orthography, and content suggest it does not date to the early dynastic period. As they explain, the forms of the signs resemble the cuneiform used on clay. So here's Aeonatum, here is cuneiform on clay with its characteristic wedge-shaped form made by the stylus in the clay. In the 3rd millennium BC, inscriptions on stone lacked that wedge-shaped form, whereas they retain it here. You can see most clearly over here. So Marchesi and Marchetti therefore reasoned that this inscription was added in modern times, using a clay tablet as a model and the well-known Aeonatum as the subject. Other incongruities they note include the unorthodox form of 2 of the cuneiform signs and the fact that the inscription does not include a dedication to a deity, as would have been common at the time. So if that analysis is correct, the addition of the inscription represents a significant modern intervention in the life of the statue. And here again, I would say, is where a biography approach can make a part of a story that might have been uncomfortable for a museum instead interesting. To say that this inscription is fake would make the statue a little bit embarrassing. But instead, we can say this is yet another moment in the life of the statue, and we can actually think about the meanings that are inherent in that moment. By adding the name, what we're seeing is the value that we today attach to famous individuals. We invest this particular individuality into the sculpture that it didn't carry in the past, that reflects our own society's interest in individuality. There were other modern restorations made as well, which can become part of this modern story. The black material in the eyebrows and eyes, and you can see this reflected on the label now, are made to resemble bitumen from antiquity. So the old label text mentions the bitumen, and now we've identified it as carbon black zinc oxide, so it's a bit more accurate. In the distant past, statues were powerful objects, invested with intentions and will of living people. Today we can respect and understand the beliefs of long ago, but we can't participate in those rituals, and we can't feel the fear and the awe that the Sumerian might have felt in the face of the gods. Instead, our modern, rational sensibilities respond to the sense of figures as portraits of individuals, as people long dead. The statues create a physical connection between us and the past. We value special individuals, our histories of presidents and kings, famous figures doing notable things. We want this figure to have a name, to be someone of importance. The inscription, therefore, adds value and meaning. In the past, though, as Evans recalls in her book, the abstraction of the piece was potentially an intentional way to distance the sculpture from individuality. So there's a disconnect between our modern esteem for the individual and the Sumerian desire to subsume individuality under the gaze of the gods. Today, the piece therefore means something very different than it did in the 3rd millennium BC. It imparts to us the meaning that we seek in it. Despite the work's missing archaeological context, we can still understand many aspects of its biography. We can also acknowledge, and we must acknowledge, that the missing information is a direct result of collecting practices that were acceptable in the past, but are no longer legal or ethical. Specific questions about where the piece was made, how it was used and reused, and its deposition cannot be answered definitively because of the loss of that context, the inevitable consequence of the object having been looted or dug up without documentation and sold on the art market. There's much to be said of interest about the modern history of the piece. Adding a king's name reflects, to raise its value, reflects our relationship with objects, and it tells a story about how we value things. So the sculpture, when we consider each moment of its biography, tells not only its story, but also our story. So this example I've walked you through is meant to illustrate how an object biography approach can be used. The modern intervention is acknowledged now in the label. The too narrow date has been broadened to reflect our lack of certainty in the date, and the location has also been broadened to reflect the possibilities of where it may have come from. And so this new label text has been done since this research. In addition to the label on the piece, which is the immediate way that that the viewer is receiving this information, we also have the publication that I mentioned, and that publication will share the longer version of the story that I told you today. So even though some history is missing and the piece poses real ethical challenges because of how it was collected, I and the other people on the project found ways to still investigate, still do research in an ethical manner, in a way that worked with the goals of the museum, and come up with a story that was a fuller story and a more transparent version of the history of the object. Okay, I would be happy to answer questions. You can ask me in French, and I might understand you.